Good morning. Thank you, Ryan, for reading our scripture reading this morning from Genesis 12. We are going to look a little bit at Abraham this morning. Excuse me. I went and played basketball with my dad for the first time in, I don't know, 10 months, over a year maybe. And I realized I have a 3-step limit. If I take more than 3 steps quick, I get out of breath. And after only an hour of half-court basketball, I had the tickle that you get after you run a mile or two. You know what I'm talking about? And so I think I've learned my lesson. I really need to get back to the gym because I'm struggling. So if I cough some, that's all it is. Please bear with me and give me a little bit of grace on that. We're going to look at Abraham a little bit this morning. I want to point out before we get started something that I think happens with some regularity in our world. We have a tendency to build up humans. Sometimes we make it as if a human that has lived before us was without flaw. Have you noticed our tendency to do that? Sometimes we do that with people that we knew personally, and we knew their flaws, yet they just go away with them as they pass. And I don't think there's anything particularly wrong with remembering the good that someone did as opposed to remembering the negative, but I think we have a tendency to take it a little too far. We just don't remember any of the negative, and we sort of turn people into saints. Or maybe we remember the imperfections, but we make excuses for them, you know? And it's not just us that do this. The Jews did this too with Old Testament characters as well. You think about the way that the Pharisees would talk about some of the Old Testament people that were written about. They didn't seem to remember some of David's flaws. They didn't seem to highlight many of the things Moses did wrong. In fact, Moses was like the guy for the Jews back then. And we do this with Bible characters as well. We often look back and say, that guy, man, if I could just be like that guy. And for good reason. There are people in the pages of Scripture who have had their name written down for the rest of time that we should absolutely try and emulate things that they do in their life. But none of them were perfect. Not a single person who lived and who even got their name written down in the Bible, and even the people who got their name written down in the Bible for good reasons, still were not perfect. But like we do with sometimes people that we knew on earth, we do it with the people in the Bible as well. Well, you know, yeah, David sinned with Bathsheba, and that was really bad. I mean, really, really bad. We don't even tell the kids that story, right? But he was a man after God's own heart, you know, and you know, like he did do all that bad stuff, but he also killed Goliath, and he had great faith, and I mean, he was chosen to be king, and you know, we make excuses for people, and we don't really look at some of the mistakes as honestly as I think we should sometimes. Abraham is a great example of this. The Jews did this with Abraham. You remember when they're talking to Jesus, and they say, we have Abraham as our father. Why was that a big deal? Because Abraham was awesome. Because Abraham was the father of the Jewish faith, and he was held up on a pedestal in the minds of the Jews. We do the same thing with Abraham. I mean, yeah, he lied about Sarah a couple times, but he's in Faith's Hall of Fame, you know, the aptly named Hebrews 11. Like, Abraham's in there, seems like more than almost anybody else, so he had to be awesome, right? Right. Abraham was awesome. I don't want you to misunderstand this or miss the point. Abraham was a faithful follower of God who was imperfect. And I want to look today at a couple of things that sometimes I think we may skip over throughout the story of Abraham. So go to Genesis chapter 12, where Ryan read for us a moment ago. Genesis chapter 12, and we're going to look at the calling of Abraham. Sometimes we read these stories of Abraham as backstory to all the awesome things that he did. You know, you think about the sacrificing of Isaac that Abraham did. When he finally got a child and God told him to go sacrifice Isaac, he was willing to go do it. And Hebrews 11 gives us some insight that he apparently believed that God was going to raise Isaac from the dead. And all this stuff beforehand, this is just building up to that great image of a father sacrificing a son that was clearly foreshadowing to God sacrificing his son. But I think that this beginning calling of Abraham may have been meant to be told in a little bit different light. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to kind of read through Genesis chapter 12, and then we'll skip ahead to chapter 16, and we'll talk about it a little bit as we go. Genesis chapter 12 and verse 1 says, "Now the Lord said to Abram, 'Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed.'" So we have about three promises here. The first promise, he says, "Go from your father's house to a land that I will show you." All right, so he starts off with, Abraham, go to a land. I've got a land prepared for you. I want you to go there. Okay, so the first promise that God makes to Abraham is a land promise. And I'm sure this is a review for some of us, the threefold promise of Abraham, but let's look closely at it. The first promise is about land. The second promise, he says, "I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing." All right, so the second promise has a little bit to do with having offspring. Really, you can't be a great nation and you can't have a great name if you don't have any children to continue on your line. That was certainly the thinking of these Hebrews who would have been reading this, and really it rings true for us today in a lot of ways as well. And then in verse 3, he says, "I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So he kind of weaves 2 and 3 together, but the second promise has to do with an offspring and a seed, a great nation, a great name, and then at the very end of verse 3, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Then the third promise is the beginning of verse 3, "I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse." All right, so bless those who bless you, curse those who curse you. So we got 3 promises: land, protection, bless those who bless you, curse those who curse you, and a seed, an offspring of some sort that is going to, the seed promise has a couple different elements to it: great name, great nation, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. So this is a big deal, right? I mean, this is a huge promise that God is making to Abraham. And if you're a Hebrew person reading this for the first time, just take a second and read this for the first time. What does it sound like? It kind of sounds like an origin story, doesn't it? I mean, this almost sounds like the beginning of a hero's journey. The gods come to him and tell him, "You will protect the world." I mean, doesn't that kind of sound like what God's doing here? He comes to him and God chooses this man, and he makes him a promise. He promises him protection, he promises him land, and he promises him that he's going to have offspring and blessings. And essentially, the very last phrase is, "In you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed." You're going to bless the whole world. This is the beginning of a hero's journey, isn't it? This is the calling of a hero. And so Abraham receives this promise from God. And if you're reading this and you've never heard it before, or imagine for a second someone is telling you this story, because more than likely before Moses wrote all of this down, this is how these stories were told, as they were spoken. And so you're hearing this, and Abram is going to be the hero. It's exciting, right? This is the hero's calling. And so verse 4, Abram went as the Lord had told him. Awesome, right? He's accepted the calling. How great is that? The hero's been called. He's been given a promise. He's been told he's going to bless the whole world, and he is doing what he was asked to do. The hero is getting on his journey. So Abraham went as the Lord told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran, and Abram took Sarai, his wife, and Lot, his brother's son, and all their possessions, that they had gathered and the people that they had acquired in Haran, and they set out to go to the land of Canaan. When they came to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land to that place at Shechem to the oak of Moreh. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. So here's Abram has accepted the calling, right? He's accepted the charge as the hero who is going to bless the whole world. And he's going to the land that God has promised him. And already, this is exciting, he's in the land. Promise number 1, fulfilled, right? It's starting. This is, how many of you guys have seen, I saw it a long time ago on TV, so I don't want to vouch for it, but the movie Unbreakable with Bruce Willis and Sam Jackson, it's like a what if superheroes were real kind of movie, and it's the Bruce Willis is learning that he is a superhero. And him and his son are in the garage playing with a bench press. And they grab a couple of weights and they put it on there and he benches it. And then his son is like, Dad, whoa. And then he's like, put some more on there. And he does it again, right? And then it's like they have all the weight on there. And I think the next shot is of them taping like the washer and dryer to the bar or something like, and it's just like he can keep doing it. And it's like, this is happening. I'm a superhero, right? That's what, in that movie, that is the idea. It's happening. I can actually save people. I'm incredibly strong. This is what's going on with Abraham. He's the hero who's going to bless the whole world. He's going to fix the problem, right? And he accepts the calling, and he's heading into the land of Canaan, and now he's in the promised land of Canaan, and he's settling there. And you may recognize some of these names from a couple of books later. In verse 7, the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your offspring I will give this land. This is the promised land, Abram. So he built there an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. From there he moved to the hill country on the east of Bethel and pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord. And Abraham journeyed on still towards the Negeb. This is it. He's in the promised land. He's the hero who's going to bless the world. He's going to fix the problem that we've seen. And now, verse 10, arises some conflict. Now, there was a famine in the land. Take a second and understand that when the Bible says there was a famine in the land, that is a sentence that the people reading this at the time would identify with immediately. Immediately, they would understand a famine. What do we think of when we think of a famine? We're going to eat a lot of frozen foods now, I guess, right? Like we don't have any concept. We don't have any concept of famine. You know, within the last couple centuries, like famine just has not been as big of a really, even just the last century, a famine just hasn't been something that affects us, this little sliver of the world in America. But when it says, now there was a famine in the land, and you're reading this in that time when your livelihood is based on rainfall and crops, and your what are we going to eat today is dependent on what you have to eat today, this was a big deal. This was a big conflict. And so Abram is in the promised land. He's on the journey. He's going to bless the world. And then verse 10, there's a famine in the promised land, which is kind of a bummer, but it also poses a great conflict for our hero. What to do when you've been promised this land by God and the land isn't doing what it's supposed to yet. Okay? So here is our hero's response. So Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe in the land. Hold on. Our hero just went away from his promise. I mean, he just all but said, thanks but no thanks, God. I liked the land, but it wasn't doing it for me, so I'm going to go to Egypt instead. He left. I mean, just take for a second the gravity of this. The God of all the universe came to you, chose you, said, you're going to bless the whole world, and has essentially set you up as the solution to a problem, and gives you the land, and you're in the land, and you look at him and say, I'm going to take care of myself the way I think I need to, and you leave the land that the God of all the universe promised and told you was yours. Are you kidding me? Well, I mean, like, I guess God's going to do something with this. I mean, 0 for 1, right? Abram's gone 0 for 1 here. God said, you're going to have this land, and Abram said, it's not working out. There's a test, and I'm going to Egypt. So Abram goes to Egypt, and there, obviously it's implied that they had food. In Egypt, it was a bigger city than Canaan was, the promised land where they were, and so let's pick back up in verse 11. When he was about to enter Egypt, he said to Sarai, his wife, I know that you are a woman beautiful in appearance. And when the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife. Then they will kill me, but they will let you live. Say you're my sister, that it may go well with me because of you, and that my life may be spared for your sake. Okay. Are you seeing any problem here? There was a second promise, a second part of this promise. And it was, I'm going to bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. I've got your back, Abram. I've got your back. I am going to give you protection on this hero's journey that you're embarking on. And so Abram leaves the promised land, and he gets into what he feels like is going to be a pretty dicey situation, because apparently 65-year-old Sarai was gorgeous, and so gorgeous that he thought, the Egyptians are going to kill me so that they can keep you. So just say you're my sister, and then we'll work this out. Well, let's see how this works out. Verse 14, Abram entered Egypt. When Abram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw the woman was very beautiful, so he was right. And when the princes of Pharaoh saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh. And the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house, and for her sake he dealt well with Abram. And he had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male servants, underline that one, female donkeys, and camels. Okay. So they get ready to go into Egypt, and Abram says, Sarai, you're too beautiful. Just tell them you're my sister, and we'll work this all out so that I don't die. He even says, they will deal well with me because of you. My life will be spared because of Sarai. Not because of God, who promised him protection, but because of Sarai. And so Abram leaves the promised land, goes into Egypt, and then immediately rejects the second part of the promise, right? He already rejected the land because it was a famine, it was too hard. And so then, now he's 0 for 2, right? He rejected God's protection. And again, he took matters into his own hands and did what he felt was right to protect himself. He didn't need God's protection. He got Sarah's protection, right? So Abram, you're 0 for 2. 2 parts of the promise, and you've rejected both. I mean, just imagine giving someone a gift and then them taking it and going, I don't think I need this. I already have something that's kind of like it, but not as good. And throwing your gift away. Like, that's just an unbelievable insult to another person. And Abram is doing this to God. Verse 17, let's continue reading. But the Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. So Pharaoh called Abram and said, what is this you have done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister, so that I took her for my wife? Now then, here is your wife. Take her and go. And Pharaoh gave men orders concerning him, and they sent him away with his wife and all that he had. All that he had, referencing all the things he brought into Egypt and also all the things he received in exchange for Sarai. Remember in verse 16, sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male servants, female donkeys, and camels. So already Abram is 0 for 2. He's rejected the land that God had given him. He's rejected the protection that God has given him. And in both cases, he took matters into his own hands and attempted to do it for himself. So let's skip on a couple chapters to chapter 16. It's a lot of fun stuff that happens in the middle, but we're going to skip to chapter 16 for right now, for time's sake. And let's pick up in verse 1, just starting in chapter 16 and verse 1. It says, Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. So that's a problem, right? Because the third part of this promise, I mean, none of it can be accomplished without a child. His name isn't going to continue on. He's not going to become a great nation. He's not going to. How could he bless nations after him if he wasn't going to have a child? And so this poses a challenge to the third part of the promise. And I think you know where this is going to go. Abraham's about to strike out. All right. Sarai had no children. Had borne him no children. She had a female Egyptian slave whose name was Hagar. I told you, underline female slaves, because it's because of Abram's rejecting of the land and rejecting of God's protection that Hagar comes into the story. Hagar came into the story because Abram lied about Sarai being his wife, and then he received all those things from Egypt, including Egyptian female slaves, as it mentions in chapter 12. And now we have that Egyptian female slave named Hagar coming into the equation. Interesting point, too. The word Hagar in Hebrew actually just means the immigrant. That's what it means. It translates to the immigrant, which kind of changes the feel of the story when you read Abraham, Sarai, and the immigrant. Doesn't it? It makes it a little more eerie. Anyway, so they have this Egyptian slave named Hagar. And Sarai, verse 2, said to Abram, "Behold, now the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my servant. It may be that I shall obtain children by her." And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. So after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar the Egyptian, her servant, and gave her to Abram, her husband, as a wife. And he went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. I want to pause here really quick, and I want to point back to something else in Genesis chapter 3, if you want to flip over there quickly. Genesis chapter 3. Anytime you see words in the Bible that, like a sentence has a lot of the same similar words, and you recognize it from somewhere else, this actually happened in class. Austin is visiting with us today, and we were in class, and we read the very last verse in the book of Galatians, showing how Paul often ends his letters with grace or grace and peace. And Austin said, hey, that has a lot of the same words as Revelation 21, the very last verse of the Bible that I assume Austin had memorized. And so we looked at it. Yeah, these are similar verses. And we talked about why that might be. Well, anytime you see a lot of words that look the same in a story and you recognize it from another story, go read the other story and look at the similarities. And it might show you something. I think right here, there's a very clear connection that is being made. I'm going to read Genesis 15 again, and then we'll flip right to Genesis 3. Genesis 15 and verse 3 says, "So after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar the Egyptian, her servant, and gave to Abram her husband as a wife. And he went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress." Look at Genesis chapter 3, and let's look at verse 6. It says, "So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate, and she also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate. Then the eyes of both were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loincloths." You see some of those same ideas? The wife took and gave, and it ended in a fractured relationship. Before this, they were completely happy being fully vulnerable with each other in the garden. After this, there was a fear that came between them. They realized they were naked. It was bad. They had to cover up. In Sarah and Abram and Hagar's situation, the wife, Sarai, took Hagar, gave to her husband, and when she had conceived, Hagar looked with contempt on her mistress. I believe that these are written this way to show us that what Abram is doing here and what Sarai is doing here is partaking in the problem that we see in Genesis chapter 3. Genesis 3, the problem is that they sinned, and that separated them from God. And that's been the problem all the way up through Genesis chapter 16. And so now here we are in Genesis 16, and Abram's already done two things that were suspect at best. And now here we are, third part of the promise, and what happens? Something that looks eerily similar to the problem. This is supposed to be the hero. This is the guy who is going to bless the whole world. And he's doing the same thing that got the whole world into this mess. So Abram, let's continue in verse 5. And Sarai said to Abram, "May the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my servant to your embrace. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me." But Abram said to Sarai, "Behold, your servant is in your power. Do to her as you please." Then Sarai dealt harshly with her, and Hagar fled. The phrase in this sentence that Abram says, "Behold, your servant is in your power. Do to her as you please," is a similar phrase to what's recorded in Genesis 6 with the flood narrative, where it says every man did what was right in their own eyes. Same idea. Sarah, do with your servant what's right in your own eyes. Do with her as you please. Again, pointing out that what Abram, the hero, and Sarai, the hero's partner, are doing is partaking in exactly the same problem that has gotten them into this mess. Instead of being the solution to the problem that the beginning of the story looks like they're going to be, they are exactly the problem that they're supposed to be fixing. And so Abram ultimately there's a lot of issues that are caused throughout this. Hagar has to run off, and God comes to Hagar as the angel of the Lord and sends her back to Abram and Sarai, and then God re-ups his covenant in chapter 17. Isaac's birth is promised. Abraham and Sarah both laugh. They get their names changed, and they both laugh. And then their child's name is Laughter, and God is now going to do this miracle child thing with Isaac. He's going to have a son born to Abraham in their old age. Sarah's going to be 90, Abraham's going to be 100, and God is going to continue to keep his promise throughout the rest of the book. This is a lot. When you read it like this, it's almost a little bit tough to take, isn't it? This is Abraham, Father Abraham, who had many sons, right? This is Abraham. And this is Abraham. You know? Three promises, and Abraham went 0 for 3. He didn't come through, he didn't trust God on any of the 3 promises that God made to him, even to the point where God has to remind him of the covenant and remind him, and even in a little way change the covenant. Instead of saying he's going to be a great nation, in chapter 17 he says, verse 4 says, "Behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be the father of a multitude of nations." Why? Because he has 2 sons now, not just Isaac. So Abraham has messed this up in so many ways. He's not the hero that we needed. So what is this? What can we learn from this story of Abraham going 0 for 3 on God's promises? I've got 3 quick applications, 2 quick ones, and one that I want to spend a little time on. The first one is something I say often when I get the opportunity to speak, and that is the way the Bible is written is important. We've talked in the past about how the style of writing is important. You can't read a law code the same way you read a story, and you can't read a story the same way you read a letter. You need to read a letter like a letter. You need to read a story like a story. Well, this is a story. When the authors, those who told the story, and Moses who wrote it down, inspired by the Holy Spirit, when they're writing this down, these stories are not arbitrarily put in places. This isn't just some backstory. This isn't just, it's not, and this is often the way that we read the stories in the Old Testament. It's not just something for us to learn from, right? It is something for us to learn from. Paul writes that the Old Testament was written for our learning, and it is good for us to learn from, but that's not all it is. It's a story, and it's a story with a purpose. It's not a story for fun. It's a story with a moral, but it's also a story with a purpose. And we'll talk about that in 1 second. But when we read the Bible, one of the questions that's really good to ask is, what was the author trying to say? What was the point of this story? How does this story connect to the next story? And how does the next story connect to these later stories that we find? We need to read the Bible the way that it was written and try and understand it the way the author intended it as well. The second thing, and this is often how we read the Bible, but like I said, it's a good thing to read the Bible and try and take something from it. The second thing I think we can understand from this story of Abraham is that God keeps his promises, even when we don't. I mean, we just read the whole story. Abraham went 0 for 3, right? God went 3 for 3, right? The Israelites, ultimately, with Moses leading them out and Joshua leading them in, made it back to the promised land. And I guess I'm not entirely up on my political climate in Israel, but I think they're still there, you know? I think there are still Israelites and Hebrews and Jews in the promised land right now. Like, God kept his promise about giving Abram and his descendants this land, which is incredible because Abram left the land. Abram didn't keep his end of the bargain. God kept his. Okay, second promise was protection. You notice, even though Abram took matters into his own hands and was going to figure out a way to take care of himself in Egypt, God afflicted Pharaoh with plagues, which is interesting that this is the first time plagues came to Egypt, not in Exodus. So God afflicted Pharaoh with plagues. What's God doing? He was taking care of Abraham and Sarai. He's taking care of him. He kept his word in protecting Abram. And just look at what a mess that causes for God. God has made a promise to a man who then turned out to be a liar. And now he has to punish Pharaoh, who in his understanding was innocent. Pharaoh, it wasn't a thing to just buy a wife. That was pretty common, right? And so God has to punish a man who is mostly innocent because the man he made a promise to was a liar, and he still keeps his end of the deal. He still keeps his promise of protection to Abram. Not just once either, because did you know Abram did it again? He did it again just a little bit later when he goes into a city and tells Sarah the same exact thing. Tell him you're my sister, not my wife. I don't want to die for this. And God does the same exact thing. He protects the liar who he made a promise to. And in this case, in this particular story, Abimelech is the king, and God comes to Abimelech and he says, hey, you're a dead man because you're about to sleep with another man's wife. And Abimelech says, I'm totally innocent. He said it was his sister. And God says, yeah, I know. But I made a promise to Abraham. And I came to you so that you didn't become guilty. God keeps his promise even when we don't. Third thing, God kept his promise to give Abraham a son. Abraham took matters into his own hands, struck out 0 for 3, and God still said, I'm not going to endorse what you did with Hagar and this whole mess that you guys have gotten yourselves into. But I am going to give you a son. I am going to keep my promise. And I am going to continue to bless the whole world through you, which is awesome. One question that made me ask is, what promises has God made to us? Because I know there's a lot of times when we don't keep up our end of the promise, but God has made a promise to us of eternal life through faith and obedience in Jesus. That's a promise God made to us. And if Abraham can go 0 for 3 and God's going to go 3 for 3, we need to have faith that even when we fail, because of God's grace, he's going to keep his promise to us the same way he did to Abraham. Last thing. This is what I understand the author to be intending with this story. I believe the intent of this story is to point all of us to Jesus. The whole Old Testament, I remember growing up when I was younger, we had a couple of memory pegs. Gallon of fruit was a memory peg for the kids in class. We're studying Galatians, gallon of fruit, because the fruit of the Spirit are in Galatians. You'll never forget it. So one of our things that we remembered about the story of the Bible was the Old Testament is Jesus is coming. The Gospels are Jesus is here. And after that is Jesus is coming again. That was how we remembered the big picture story of the Bible. And so with that in mind, the Old Testament is Jesus is coming. The whole point of the Old Testament is we need a solution to the problem in Genesis 3. Genesis 3, sin and death are introduced into the world because of Adam and Eve. And from that point, it's a problem. In fact, it gets so bad in Genesis 6 that God is deeply saddened that he created them, that he created man, and sends a flood to wipe out the whole earth and start again. And then they keep doing all the same stuff. Abram messes up. You think Abram's the hero, and then he's not, right? You think you look at Moses. Moses was awesome, and then he wasn't. And then you look at David or Saul. Saul was pretty cool at the beginning, and then he was really bad. And then David is great, man after God's own heart, who does everything wrong at times. And then you get to the prophets. I mean, you go through, and the whole Bible is this drama of here's the problem of sin. Who's going to fix it? And so the prophets prophesy about the Messiah, the chosen one, the one that's going to fix it. This story of Abraham is at the very beginning of the Bible, I believe, to show us that Abraham is not the guy. Even though he's chosen by God and he has the promises from God, he's not the guy. What Abraham basically does here, this would be the equivalent of what Abraham just did, the story we just read. If Clark Kent, walking through whatever city it is, sees the villain approach, takes off his glasses, and his hair comes down in curls, and he gets ready to fight, and then the villain gets really big, and he puts back his glasses, and he picks his hair, and he takes off, right? I mean, that's what happened here. Abraham was the hero. He was going to fix the problem. He was going to bless the whole world. And then famine came, and he put his glasses back on, right? And then he was in peril in Egypt, and he fixed his hair back up. I mean, he's not the guy, right? If this was a movie, and we watched this movie thinking he was the hero, we'd boo, right? We'd boo in the theater. But what kind of movie is this? It's because Abraham is not the guy. He's pointing us to the guy. Jesus is the guy. Think about this. Jesus is the hero. He passed all three tests that Abram failed here. Remember how Jesus starts his ministry in Matthew chapter 4? With a self-imposed famine, right? 40 days. A 40-day fast is how Jesus starts his ministry. In the wilderness, right? You see all these parallels? He's in a land, there's no food. He then is tempted by the devil, and he refutes him with scripture and eventually defeats the devil in that battle. Then the promise of protection that God gave to Abraham. Jesus is a man on earth with all the power he could ever want. If anyone was going to take things into his own hands, Jesus could have, right? And yet, what does he say when Peter whacks off Malchus's ear? Put your sword away. Why? Because it's not up to us to protect us. It's up to God. He promised us. And then the last one, the blessing, that you're going to bless all the nations. We see Jesus wrestling with going through with the cross. We do. We see him in the garden praying 3 times all night long to the point of shedding blood. Please, if there's any other way, God, do it the other way. But if I have to take this, not my will, but your will be done. Jesus went 3 for 3. Where Abraham failed, where Abraham was going to be the hero and then just fell flat on his face, Jesus passed the test. He was the perfect human and the perfect sacrifice, and he was the hero that we have needed from the beginning. Like Brent said so well in his Lord's Supper devotional this morning, Jesus did what had to be done so that God could tear the veil and we could be back in a relationship with him. This is the completion to the story. This is the solution to the problem of Genesis 3. Abraham, the story of Abraham is put in this way, I believe, to show us that humans can't do it, that we need a hero like Jesus. The question this morning is, are you going to let him save you? Ultimately, the hero is here, but I remember in The Incredibles, there was a scene where a man was trying to jump off a building and commit suicide, and Mr. Incredible ran through and saved the man's life, diving into a building. And later, the man sued him. And Mr. Incredible said, "I saved your life." And the man said, "No, you ruined my death." It's a funny little scene. But oftentimes, as Christians, that's the mentality that we have. Is Jesus saving our life, or is he keeping us from doing all the things that we want to do? The question is, are we going to let the hero of the story of the Bible save us? He came and he died on the cross so that he could save us, and he's given us a choice to take that gift. Have you taken that gift? If you need the prayers of the church, or if you need to accept